So, good morning everyone, my name is Paula. Thank you so much for coming here today. I'm an associate lecturer in EAP and TESOL at the University of St Andrews, and I'm also the Academic English Service Director, which is our fancy name for in-sessional support. In this presentation today I'm going to be talking a little bit about what is flipped learning and how we understand flipped learning in the context of an online pre-sessional course. I am aware that I have a little bit of a difficult accent, so if something is not clear or you don't understand, don't be shy, just ask me, and I'm used to repeating myself. I'm a teacher, so. I'm going to start a little bit by telling you about the project and how it came to light and how all this data is coming from. And then I'm going to move on to talk about what is flipped learning in the literature and whether we've agreed on something or not quite. And then I'll move on to tell you a little bit about how we can enact flipped learning in a specific context. I'll introduce the context of my research and I'll try to be brief because I know not everyone is a fan of methodologies. I am, so if you have any further questions, please ask. And then we'll be looking at the different voices in this research, so course designers, team leaders and teachers, and I am aware that I might be using words that are specific to the context, so we'll be explaining those as we go along. And then by the end of the session, I'll just summarize a little bit what we've discussed and think about the implications for practice. I do want to invite you along to reflect on, where's my slide? I'm missing a slide here. Okay, never you mind. So I'll just start talking about the research project then. So this is part of a big project, which was my ED thesis, and I collected the data in summer 2020. And I don't think I need to tell you anything about that, because you've lived through it. So it was a challenging time. We were still in the emergency remote teaching period, and I'm forever grateful to all my participants that took the time in that weird season that we had to talk to me about flipped learning. Originally, this is a mixed methods research, but today I'm just going to be concentrating on qualitative data that came from the semi-structured interviews. It's a much bigger project that includes voices from the students as well when it comes to understanding flipped learning and how they actually conceptualize it and engage with it. But today we'll be concentrated on what teachers and management and course directors think about flipped learning. I want to be quite transparent as well, and I have to say at the time I was working at the institution that I'm referring to in this presentation, so this is an example of an insider researcher, and I have a lot of love for my former institution, so just to be clear, I didn't actually teach in the presessional. I'm more of an in-sessional tutor, but it is, you know, my former institution. So as we go along, I do want you to think a little bit about what is flipped learning for you and what do you understand by flipped learning. I feel like flipped learning is a bit of a buzzword, and there are many different conceptualizations. And what informs your understanding of flipped learning? How did you get to understand flipped learning in the way that you do? And there's not a right or wrong answer. It's just about your own experience. So, when looking at understanding flipped learning, the first thing I did was go into the literature, and I got a definition from the Flipped Learning Network. If you're not very familiar with this is Bergmann and Sands, and they're credited with inventing flipped learning as we kind of understand it nowadays. Controversially, this is a commercial web page, so their purpose is to train everyone in the way they use flipped learning. I love this definition because it's got very clearly there that it's a pedagogical approach, so it opens up the space to different interpretations and different enactments of flipped learning, and it doesn't actually say anything about technology. is all about what the students are doing and where they're doing it. So Abeysekera and Dawson, 2014, I want to say, they got this lovely summary of the literature, and they come up with these 4 key principles of flipped learning, of these 4 characteristics, and one of them is the use of technology. Technology is great and it can be used to create flipped materials, but it's not about the format, it's about what the students are doing. In that line, when I talk about flipped learning, I think about Bloom's taxonomy, and it's about inverting Bloom's taxonomy. So traditionally in the classroom space, we do understanding tasks and remembering tasks and activating schemata, and then activities that are more about applying the knowledge and creating something new tend to happen outside of the classroom space. With the flip approach, the students have activated the schemata already, they've done a little bit of understanding, and then they come to the sessions ready to apply the knowledge and create wonderful essays or wonderful products that we want them to do at the end. This is not just me, of course. It brings Lockwood's approach and understanding of flipped learning. Okay? So, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research context. This is an EAP presessional course at a Russell Group University here in the UK, and my participants were either in the 10 weeks or the 6 weeks presessional course. If you're not familiar with presessional, but I'm guessing you all are, they're very intense and everyone is very stressed and there's not a lot of time. So high stakes. In this particular centre, flipped learning had been adopted in 2018, which made 2020 the 3rd year. Now at the beginning of the session I'll say like, ooh, 2020 was a difficult time. No excuses for flipped learning not running as smooth, because it was the 3rd time, okay? So that's something that I want to highlight. I think when we're talking about the sessions took place online, and for me, that's emergency remote teaching. And making assumptions and inferences on that teaching, transferring it to online learning is very problematic. Online learning has a strong research tradition, and it's great that we have a space to reflect on our experiences of emergency remote teaching. And if you're familiar with the Apply Academic Practice Journal, they got this lovely special interest issue where they open up the space for us to reflect on those CRT experiences and help us inform our pedagogies moving forward. And I think that's great, and it's a way of closing that gap between theory and practice. However, when we're thinking about flipped learning, it was the 3rd time that happened, so it was a solid, implemented approach, and I feel like it's quite fair to make inferences based on this, okay? Of course, because of the nature of my research, I'm talking about transferability rather than general outcome. I'm not even going to say that word, but you know the one I mean. Okay, so a little bit more back to the research context and making it more specific. I want to start by saying that the quality of materials was consistently praised because they were fantastic materials. In blue, you have my participants and sort of like the voices that you're going to be hearing in this talk today, but just to give you a little bit of an idea of the dimension of the program, which is quite big. There's about 2 course directors permanent and 4 during the busy times, around 15 team leaders, and I did promise that I will explain team leader. So team leader is a very, very, very good teacher that can support new teachers to the context. They are very organized, they are very helpful, and they're in between the course director and team leader. In St Andrews we will talk about deputies. I'm sure other contexts use different names for this. In terms of teachers, that's about 150. I only interviewed 8. I'm not that popular, I didn't get those many participants. And when it comes to students, we're looking at around 2,000 students. So it's a big course, and it's a small sample. From my participants, 3 were permanent members of staff, and then the other 5 were temporary members of staff. We do have this idea of the returner, which is someone who's done a pre-sessional and then they come back to that. To be a teacher in a pre-sessional, and I think this is pretty standard across the industry, we're looking for TEFL-Q teachers, which is Delta level. Okay. So, when chatting a little bit about the course with the course director, and I just want to reassure everyone that I have used pseudonyms, so everything is very private and protected. I wanted to know basically why they adopted flipped learning. Although I'm a fan of flipped learning, I started with a little bit of skepticism. I didn't quite trust it at the beginning. So I wanted to know why they did that, how they conceptualize it, and what basically it looked like in their head when they were deciding the course. And I learned that flipped learning was actually adopted as a way to respond to circumstances. So they were too busy, they need a lot more rooms, and this was a way of making things work. Funnily enough, they gave it a go, and it worked really well, because flipped learning was fostering autonomy, and it was enabling teachers to have genuine student-centered lessons. And as we know, that's one of the principles of EAP. We're all about our students and where they are and how we can get them there, where they need to be. Their understanding was similar to what I've explained at the beginning. This brings Lockwood's approach to flipped learning, but there was also a little bit of task-based learning and andragogy, and again, that's part of the nature of EAP. We are eclectic, we take what works and then throw it in the classroom. Interestingly, for me as a researcher, I found out that the flipped content was not necessarily informing the sessions. It was also informing the assessment. So for me, as a researcher, after a 40-minute conversation, I was like, aha, constructive alignment. We have our learning outcomes, we have our assessments and our tags, everything is linked together, everything makes sense. So I was quite curious whether that understanding was filtered down all the way through. Because I'm a big fan of explicitly explaining what you're doing, I asked whether flipped learning was part of the induction program, and it was in 2018 and it was in 2019, but because of the nature of 2020, there was nothing, okay? So that was the gap there. And I do have a little quote, and I'll just let you read it. So it's just explaining a little bit how there was no direct exploration of flipped learning with the practitioners. You'll see there's a little QR code there. I've given you a big analysis and only a little quote, and that's not okay. So if you go into the QR code, you can see all my data, and then you can judge whether my analysis is fair or not fair. You'll see the QR code throughout, because I didn't want to bore you with a lot of quotes, but it's kind of hard to get the balance right. So, moving on to team leaders, I want to draw your attention to a couple of key ideas. So there was, we see the second quote, William, he was quite open about, okay, flipped learning is just a way of making money, which, you know, I mean, it is part of the industry that we're in, and there's a lot of pressure in that sense. Because this comes from a team leader, though, it is a little bit of a worry for me, because in 2018 and 2019 this was openly addressed, so how we use flipped learning, so that's a bit problematic. Interestingly, Dennis talks a little bit about how the teachers just want to focus on the practicalities. They don't want to know what the pedagogical principles are. I think this may be a bit of a problematic generalization, and it can actually hinder teaching and learning, particularly, you know, if we think about LCT, if you're saying, oh, I'm going to do a lesson on writing a paragraph and using semantic waves. You can't expect the teacher to then go and use it if you're not explaining what that is. So, yeah, I think teachers are interested in pedagogies. So it was all about, you know, that perception that teachers just want to know what they're doing and where they're doing it and not get engaged in those discussions. It was also evident that there was a bit of an unclear understanding of what flipped learning is and why it was used. So having a look at the course director and the team leaders, I'm going to move on to the teachers, because they're the fun bit. What a lovely quote from Cedric. So Cedric can see that the students can see that there is a link between the flip materials and the sessions, and they're coming in there and they're building on that information. So as these initial stages can happen, and then they go into the session and they can create, they can analyze, they can evaluate what they've been exploring. This is a bit of a lengthy quote, but it's quite important. So Naomi is saying, yes, flip learning, and is working in my online environment. So she can see that because the students are preparing before the sessions, her online sessions are a little bit easier. These tricky grammar questions have been already addressed, and she can take the lesson a little bit further. So Naomi's a returner. She had done the course before, and again, flip learning makes her life easier in the online environment. Now I want you to compare that with the next quote. So flip learning principles were completely lost in this practitioner. And that is problematic, because if we are building a course thinking about our constructive alignment and what our students need to do and not need to do in the session, if then I go to the session and I repeat the flip content, what the students feel is like a waste of their time, which is something that came up in the data as well. So for Clarence, there was a massive gap between flip learning and online learning, and that can be quite problematic for the teaching and learning. It's not all green though. So I love Jen's quote because it shows that we can conceptualize flip learning in different ways, and it's still all about inverting Bloom's taxonomy. So she talks about this idea of asking the students to prepare and then come to the front of the session and actually teach it. And I do take the point that the students that are listening are maybe not engaging in the higher order thinking skill tasks, but the ones that are presenting and explaining it, they are. So it is a different conceptualization of flip learning that can work and can be very welcome into the EAP classroom. Okay, so just to summarize a little bit, from the data, I could see that practitioners were systematically demonstrating very different conceptualizations of flip learning. And I know I'm not talking about the students today, but that was really different from the students. All the students knew what flip learning was, and when they discussed it with me, they used meta language like andragogy, and I was like, oh my goodness. And it's because before, like as they're sort of like a started assignment, they got to read about flip learning, so they knew what they were doing, and they were like, we're using flip learning because we're grown-ups and we know that this is going to help us and it's going to develop autonomy. And then that didn't necessarily happen with all my teacher participants or, you know, team leaders participants. And I said before, I am very, very mindful that 2020 was a complicated time, and of course there was not that space to address that in the induction, but it had been addressed before, and it was still, you know, unclear for returners and at different levels of that course design. Different understandings that flipped learning can of course coexist, and it's exciting, and it's all about doing what works for our students. And I think Leicester's vision at flipped learning is wonderful, but it's maybe not filtered down all the way, so that's something that can be addressed. And just one more minute, I'm going to keep you. So what do we make of all of this? Flipped learning appears in different ways in the literature and in practice. Talking about flipped learning in specific terms can help our teachers and our students understand what is it that we do. And I am sympathetic to the problems of pre-sessionals and that top-down approach to make sure that there is consistency and that there is quality of materials and student experience and so on and so forth. But there is a danger that these pedagogical principles are becoming invisible to our teachers. So it's really, really important that we address them openly. If you went to Steve's sessions yesterday, he was talking about making explicit the principles and values underpinning surface EAP. I think all our pedagogical principles should be there for our teachers to challenge, to embrace, to adopt, and make them their own in the classroom. So, this is my lovely reference list. Thank you so much. Questions?